Hi, I'm Josh, and I'm so grateful you've decided to click on this video even though you saw how long it is. I don't even know how long it is because I've only just started recording this, and my present is your past, and time is very weird, and here I am wasting it. So the reason that I assume this is one of my longest videos is because it is one of my most complex videos, because I am covering the first 3 books of the Dune series, Dune Messiah, and Children of Dune, plus the new Dune film, directed by Denis Villeneuve. So, I've got a lot of ground to cover here. Let's get to it. I'm going to start with a very brief plot synopsis, and it is going to be brief because I'm not going to spoil anything. I'm just going to cover things in very much a vague level of detail. So, the original Dune book is about the Atreides family. The Atreides family are sort of a noble family within the empire of the galaxy, or the universe that Dune takes place in. And the Emperor assigns the Atreides to go and take over control of the planet Arrakis, aka Dune, from their mortal enemies, the Harkonnens. Now, Dune is a very unforgiving desert planet that is very inhospitable to human life, and so it's not the most desirable place to live. However, it is probably the most valuable planet in the Empire because it produces spice, which, among other things, is necessary for interstellar travel. So it is a very important planet, and those who control it thus have a lot of power. Of course, the Harkonnens are extremely unhappy that the Atreides are taking over Dune from them, and they come into conflict, things happen, and we're not going to get into any of the other details of the story. Now, getting into the next book, Dune Messiah, we fast forward 12 years from the end of the original Dune book. And Messiah is a much smaller book and much more narrow in its focus, whereas Dune has a very broad, planet-wide and even galaxy-wide focus in its story. Dune really kind of focuses on just a handful of characters, with the main storyline being an assassination plot. And so it is a much smaller book and a smaller focus. Now, going on to the third book, Children of Dune, we fast forward again 9 years from the end of Dune Messiah. And once again, this is a larger book with a larger scope and a larger cast of characters like the original Dune book. For obvious spoiler reasons, I can't really talk about anything that happens in here other than to say it just kind of follows the continuing story of the Atreides family and how things continue to work out on the planet of Arrakis here. The reason why book 3 is kind of a natural ending point in this series, even though there are several more books in the entire Dune series, is because after the third book, there is, I think, a 3,500 year leap forward in time to the fourth book in the series. So the third one here represents kind of a natural ending point. And I've decided to end the series here and not continue reading the full 6 or 7 or however many books are in the actual series. And I'll get into why that's the case later on in this video. So on the whole, the books are very well written. The prose is actually really quite beautiful at times, and I'm going to read a few examples for you here just to give you an idea of the style in which the books are written. So starting off with a passage from book 1, we read, "Paul continued to stare across the basin. He inhaled, sensed the softly cutting contralto smell of sage climbing the night. The predatory bird, he thought of it as the way of the desert. It had brought a stillness to the basin so unuttered that the blue milk moonlight could almost be heard flowing across sentinel saguaro and spiked paint bush. There was a low humming of light here, more basic in its harmony than any other music in his universe." So just descriptors like the smell of sage climbing the night and the blue milk moonlight could almost be heard really is very beautiful description. Here's another brief example from book 1. "The mouth snaked toward the narrow crack where Paul and Jessica huddled. Cinnamon yelled in their nostrils. Moonlight flashed from crystal teeth." So again, the scent of cinnamon yelled in their nostrils is an interesting descriptor. Here's another. She parted a jungle overlapping of leaves, looked through to the center of the room. A low fountain stood there, small, with fluted lips. The rhythmic noise was a pealing, spooling arc of water falling thud-a-gallop onto the metal bowl. I like that word, thud-a-gallop. Fast forwarding now to book 3, we read this. How long ago had that been? More than 20 years. She did not like to think of those intervening heartbeats. Time lay within her like a dead weight, and it was as though her years away from this planet had never been. I think it's just gorgeous to describe the passage of time as those intervening heartbeats and just the life that is expended as time goes on. Now, it's not all perfect prose. There was this one kind of weird description that made me raise an eyebrow. This one is talking about a young man becoming physically aroused, and it said, there was an adult beef swelling in his loins, and he felt his mouth open, clinging to the girder shape of ecstasy. Beef swelling in his loins. Now, you might get the impression from these descriptions that Dune is a fairly dense book, and you might have heard that described from other people. And I found books 1 and 2 to be actually fairly easy to read. Book 3 I did find to be more dense in its prose and in just trying to follow the story. And here's one example of what I mean from book 3. How simple it was. They were buffoons with barricaded eyes, their shoulders held in positions of immovable defense. Each position upon the great floor could be seen as an atrophic collision from which dead flesh might slough away to reveal skeletons. Their bodies, their clothes, and their faces described individual hells, the insucked breast of concealed terrors, the glittering hook of a jewel become substitute armor. The mouths were judgments full of frightened absolutes, cathedral prisms of eyebrows showing lofty and religious sentiments which their loins denied. So that's kind of an example of the more dense prose that really kind of slowed me down as I was reading book 3 here. But on the whole, I tend to think of science fiction books as being largely technical because of the science aspect of the books, but there really is kind of a lot of beauty to Frank Herbert's prose in these books. Now, having said that, there were some things in Dune that was written in the 1960s that really don't hold up very well today. For instance, there's the main villain of Book 1, the Baron Harkonnen, and a couple of ways in which we know that this character is a villain is because he is described as being grossly fat and he's a homosexual. So these are sort of labels that are put on this character that are supposed to, I assume, accentuate the villainous nature of this character. The whole being fat thing is something that's really emphasized a lot in Book 1, and we have this passage that kind of adds to it. Lady Fenring, noting the young man's poise and the sure flow of muscles beneath the tunic, thought, here's one who won't let himself go too fat. In addition to that, we have a world where the men are very much the leaders and the rulers of what is going on. Now, on the plus side, for a book written in the 60s, there are some very strong female characters, the Lady Jessica being one prime example of that, but there are several female characters who have a lot of strength and a lot of importance within the story. However, when it comes to the top rulers, the people who are calling the shots, they are definitely the men in the story. And even in Book 3, where there is a pair of twins who are part of the main storyline, the male twin becomes the leader over his sister and becomes the more important character of the two. In describing the female twin, now, the male's twin's name is Leto, and it says, she often said that she only did what she had to do, but where Leto led, she would follow. So, again, the male member of that pair is the one who definitely takes on the leadership role. And that just is kind of an overarching theme of the books here. The final thing that doesn't really sit well with me in modern times, or even in the time it was written, I think, is the age of the love interests that are happening here. In book one of the main characters' name is Paul, and he's a 15-year-old boy, and he ends up falling in love with a girl who is roughly 14 or 15 years old, and the nature of their relationship, because of their age, I find slightly uncomfortable. But it's even worse in book 3, because these twins I'm talking about are 9-year-old twins, and especially towards the end of the book, we get hints of romance between these 9-year-old kids and people who are much older than them, which is really quite creepy. Even though these twins are described to have adult minds trapped in children's bodies, they still are 9-year-old children, and that is pretty creepy. So these few elements here throw a bit of discomfort into the beauty that is the prose of these books here. Now, moving on from the way the books are written to the themes here, we have a lot of very interesting themes that are covered throughout these 3 books. And I really admire Frank Herbert for the way he tackles some major themes and really kind of makes us examine them and the problems within these systems. So one thing that Frank Herbert is really critical of is governments and the ruling class in general. So let me read a few passages from book 3 to illustrate this point. Frank Herbert writes, "Governments, if they endure, always tend increasingly toward aristocratic forms. No government in history has been known to evade this pattern. And as the aristocracy develops, government tends more and more to act exclusively in the interests of the ruling class, whether that class be hereditary royalty, oligarchs of financial empires, or entrenched bureaucracy." Herbert then takes it a step further with this statement. Knowing where her thoughts meandered, Leto said, "Power attracts the psychotics. Always. That's what we have to avoid within ourselves." And there is a lot of criticism towards those who seek to obtain power over others, which is really kind of the core tenet of anarchist philosophy, which says that any sort of caste system where some people are placed above others is a destructive system, and for true egalitarianism, people need to be truly equal in terms of the power dynamics. So Frank Herbert definitely has these kind of hints of anarchism in the way he describes power and rulers. Here's one final point about that, where he talks about the powerful keeping the population in check. I'm quoting a character here who is speaking and saying, "A large populace held in check by a small but powerful force is quite a common situation in our universe, and we know the major conditions wherein this large populace may turn upon its keepers. 1. When they find a leader. This is the most volatile threat to the powerful. They must retain control of leaders. 2. When the populace recognizes its chains. Keep the populace blind and unquestioning. 3. When the populace perceives a hope of escape from bondage. They must never even believe that escape is possible." And then skipping forward a few paragraphs, "The traditional ways to counter growing unrest paraded themselves before Alia's awareness. People had to be taught that opposition was always punished and assistance to the ruler was always rewarded. Imperial forces must be shifted in random fashion. Major adjuncts to imperial power had to be concealed. Every movement by which the Regency countered potential attack required delicate timing to keep the opposition off balance." And I'm sure as I read these passages, we see familiar ways in which the powerful and the rich retain their power over the population at large. Now, moving on from governments and rulers, another thing that Herbert is highly critical of is religion, especially when religion and politics are combined, as we see in book 1 here. She had quoted a Bene Gesserit proverb to him, quote, "When religion and politics travel in the same cart, the riders believe nothing can stand in their way. Their movement becomes headlong, faster and faster and faster. They put aside all thought of obstacles and forget that a precipice does not show itself to the man in a blind rush until it's too late." End quote. This message is carried on in book 2, where a character named Edric says, "And rulers are notoriously cynical where religions are concerned. Religion, too, is a weapon. What manner of weapon is religion when it becomes the government?" And then this other character says, "Sacred, as with all things sacred, it gives with one hand and takes with the other." And then in book 3, this moves on to the perspective of being a god. A character, once again, is talking and says, "To be a god can ultimately become boring and degrading. There to be reason enough for the invention of free will. A god might wish to escape into sleep and be alive only in the unconscious projections of his dream creatures." And finally, going back to book 2, I think there's a good point that is made here, which is that if we want to worship something, then worship the beauty of life itself. And here's what this passage says. "Life changed those irascible wastes into shapes of grace and movement," he thought. That was the message of the desert. Contrast stunned him with realization. He wanted to turn to the aides massed in the siege entrance and shout to them, "If you need something to worship, then worship life. All life, every last crawling bit of it. We're all in this beauty together." So I think those are very interesting takes on religion and things that I tend to agree with on the whole. A couple of other themes that I don't have any quotes for. One that is constantly explored throughout the 3 books is the idea of fate and our control over the future, how much power we have to influence the future. That's something that's really covered a lot throughout the books. One thing that I liked too is that Frank Herbert also takes the savior trope and completely subverts it, totally flips it on its head. And you might not get that just from reading the first book of Dune. But as we read on in books 2 and 3, we definitely see that this whole savior idea is being completely turned upside down, which I think is very interesting. The next target of Herbert's criticism is wealthy corporations and their control of money. This is represented by a company called the Chom Company that is mentioned periodically throughout the books, and the way they hold power through economic control. But narrowing down the focus to that of the individual now, and sort of sticking with the theme of reality and belief here. In book 3, we get some discussions about humans and their knowledge of the world and reality. Another character is speaking here and says, "But I realize that humans cannot bear very much reality," he said. "Most lives are a flight from selfhood. Most prefer the truths of the stable. You stick your heads into the stanchions and munch contentedly until you die. Others use you for their purposes. Not once do you live outside the stable to lift your head and be your own creature." And then moving ahead a few pages. "I'm going to rub your faces in things you try to avoid. I don't find it strange that all you want to believe is only that which comforts you. How else do humans invent the traps which betray us into mediocrity? How else do we define cowardice?" And then taking that a step forward into the topic of knowledge, there's this single sentence that says, "Knowing was a barrier which prevented learning." See the Dunning-Kruger effect for more on that idea. And this final point about knowledge is made here. "To claim absolute knowledge is to become monstrous. Knowledge is an unending adventure at the edge of uncertainty." Now, some of these ideas were kind of explored to a certain extent in book 1 here, and we have a couple of passages from book 1. We have a hint at the artificiality of a lot of individuals, and it says, "Seeing all the chattering faces, Paul was suddenly repelled by them. They were cheap masks locked on festering thoughts, voices gabbling to drown out the loud silence in every breast." To drown out the loud silence, that's an interesting phrase. Here's another character thinking to herself. "What was it St. Augustine said?" she asked herself. "The mind commands the body and it obeys. The mind orders itself and meets resistance." Which is an idea that's picked up on in this passage in book 2, where a character says, "I told him that to endure oneself may be the hardest task in the universe." But then finally, sort of jumping back to book 1 again, in the very basic essence of life, where a character is once again thinking to herself, and her thoughts are, "For now is my grief heavier than the sands of the seas," she thought. "This world has emptied me of all but the oldest purpose, tomorrow's life. I live now for my young duke and the daughter yet to be." And with everything that's happened to me, that really resonates. I'm just going to pause for a quick second here and send out a big thank you to my Patreon supporters, especially to my higher tier supporters, Joanna, Asmondas Perfect, Paul, and Mojo Dam. Your support just means the world to me. It truly does help me to put the hours and hours of work that go into making a video like this. And if you could consider supporting my efforts, check out my Patreon. I would appreciate that a lot. Now back to the Dune discussion. Now, moving away a bit from people and individuals, we have one of the major themes of Dune, which is an ecological and environmental message. Like I said, this planet, Arrakis, is described as being a very harsh environment for human life, and therefore humans have to treat the environment with a great deal of respect in order to continue to survive themselves. So in book one, we read this, where one of the characters is talking about the history of the way people have treated planets and how it has to be different here on Arrakis. And the character says, "The historical system of mutual pillage and extortion stops here on Arrakis," his father said. "You cannot go on forever stealing what you need without regard to those who come after. The physical qualities of a planet are written into its economic and political record. We have the record in front of us, and our course is obvious." This being in tune with nature is carried through to book 3 here, where humanity's effect on the environment is explored even more. And here it talks about the idea of earlier, quote, primitive humans versus more modern ones, and maybe how the primitive isn't necessarily a bad thing. It says, "A sophisticated human can become primitive. What this really means is that the human's way of life changes. Old values change, become linked to the landscape with its plants and animals. This new existence requires a working knowledge of those multiplex and cross-linked events usually referred to as nature. It requires a measure of respect for the inertial power within such natural systems. When a human gains this working knowledge and respect, that is called being primitive. The converse, of course, is equally true. The primitive can become sophisticated, but not without accepting dreadful psychological damage." In book 2, it sort of has an interesting quote that talks about the need to have a really long-term view of things, especially when it comes to the environment and ecological systems. A character says, "Before us, all methods of learning were tainted by instinct. We learned how to learn. Before us, instinct-ridden researchers possessed a limited attention span, often no longer than a single lifetime." It's funny to hear a lifetime being described as a limited attention span, but that's kind of true when it comes to ecology. Now, the race of people in Dune who are sort of portrayed as being primitive are called the Fremen, although the reality is they are the ones who are most in tune with the planet and with nature and with survival in this harsh environment. As part of this survival need, the idea of individualism is not even considered, because the preservation of the tribe as a whole is what matters and is what's important. So we read in book 1, where two characters are speaking with each other. "Your people show good discipline," Jessica said. She lowered the binoculars, saw that Stilgar was looking at them. "They obey the preservation of the tribe," he said. So individual discipline is related to the needs of the tribe as a whole. This idea is carried forward into book 3 here. And a character, once again, is speaking and says, "You see, whatever system animals choose to survive by must be based on the pattern of interlocking communities, interdependence, working together in the common design, which is the system. And this system will produce the most knowledgeable rulers ever seen." So this idea is one that's completely counter to our modern individualistic view of life, where we put individual freedoms as the top priority, and the community as a whole is no longer a thing as a result, which is much to our detriment as humans, I believe. I agree very strongly with this final passage here on this topic. It says, "Maud-Dib taught us one thing above all others, that humans can endure only in a fraternity of social justice." So I really like the Fremen and their approach to life as a whole. Now, speaking of life, Herbert does get into life as a whole in a couple of areas here. So we start in book 1, where it says, "Deep in the human unconscious is a pervasive need for a logical universe that makes sense. But the real universe is always one step beyond logic." As a personal pet peeve, that's why I despise the whole idea of karma and the idea that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. This is a doctrine that makes sense because people want there to be order and justice in the universe. But with the life I've had, the trauma I've experienced, all the horrible things I've gone through from a very young age, I would have to, by that logic, have been just a horrible person. And so I really despise that idea. And I really agree with Herbert when he says that the universe is always one step beyond logic. And I also agree with him here when he says, she said, the mystery of life isn't a problem to solve, but a reality to experience. And then finally in book 2, a character is thinking to themselves here, thinking, the flesh surrenders itself, he thought. Eternity takes back its own. Our bodies stirred these waters briefly, danced with a certain intoxication before the love of life and self, dealt with a few strange ideas, then submitted to the instruments of time. What can we say of this? I occurred, I am not. Yet I occurred. And my own philosophy is one which I describe as a happy nihilistic view of the world, where there's not necessarily meaning in everything. We're simply here and we exist, but as Herbert says, yet I occurred. And there is meaning in just existing. So I think that's really cool. So I've spent a lot of time here on the themes of the books, but for me, that's where a lot of the interest and the pleasure of the books came from, as opposed to the storyline and the plot itself. So what did I think about these books as a whole? I have to say that despite my enjoyment of and appreciation of these themes that were explored by Herbert, the books and their stories were for me a bit of a slog to get through. And a major contributing factor to that was the fact that there were so few characters that I really enjoyed and really liked as I was reading through the stories. There's nobody that I really latched onto and thought, I really love this character and I'm really interested in following what they're doing here. For instance, we have this one character who is supposed to be one of our heroes, who is one of the main characters of the book, describing his impact on the universe. This character says, statistics. At a conservative estimate, I've killed 61 billion, sterilized 90 planets, completely demoralized 500 others. I've wiped out the followers of 40 religions, which have existed since... And then another character interrupts him. So this is kind of one of our, quote, good guys in the book, and these are the things he's done. So I think that's kind of the point of the books, though, is that even people who are maybe full of good intentions don't necessarily do good things. And speaking of that, there is some really amazing character development that happens over the course of these 3 books. Especially since I carried on reading beyond book 1. In books 2 and 3, we really see development of characters. People such as Paul, Jessica, Aaliyah, Duncan, Idaho, their storylines and how they develop and change as characters throughout the books are very interesting. And despite my kind of dislike of most of the characters, there were a couple that I thought were kind of cool. Towards the end of book 1, there's a young child who I really enjoyed as a character. She brought some light to just the very end of book 1, although when I continued reading about her in the subsequent books, I disliked her as a character as she developed and changed. So unfortunately that didn't last very long. And then in book 3, one of sort of the, quote, bad guys, I guess, the one on a different team, I thought was a very interesting character, but he just kind of faded out in the second half of book 3. He was kind of a major player in the first half of the book, and then just really kind of disappeared from the storyline and popped up a little bit at the end again. So unfortunately, this other character that I was really kind of clicking with sort of, for some reason, faded away in the second half of the book. And then the very end of book 3, I found just really kind of jumped the shark a bit. I felt it sort of went a bit overboard with what was happening, and I obviously can't talk about it because of spoilers, but I don't necessarily think very highly of how it all kind of wrapped up in book 3 there. So because of all of this, it's hard for me to give the book a rating because they're so well written, but they have a couple of really problematic things in them. And I don't click with the characters, but the themes are so interesting and explored in such a fascinating way. So I think what it comes down to is my level of enjoyment wasn't super high. But then again, even at the end of book one, I was fairly lukewarm on it. But then when I watched the movie, I found myself watching other videos on YouTube about the lore and the universe of Dune and finding myself becoming very interested in the extended universe and all the little details of the world there. And so it kind of brought me back in a bit for book two. And again, there's just these kind of mixed feelings, but if I have to nail down a rating, I think I'm going to give it a 6.5 out of 10. It could have been much higher if I just enjoyed my reads more, if I found the characters to be more likable and the story to be more fun. But that's, I guess, where I'm at, and I won't keep babbling on because I still need to talk about the film. So the new Dune movie, directed by Denis Villeneuve, obviously covers the first half of book one of Dune, and I think his hope is to have at least 2 more films that cover the second half of book one and then book two, Dune Messiah. As a result, the first film really was a lot of sort of build up, getting to know the worlds, the characters, the environment, and really setting the scene for the more action-packed second half of the book that I assume is going to be covered in the second movie. So my thoughts on the film are that there are 2 very different perspectives, I think, that people are going to have towards the movie. One is going to be as a reader of the book, and one is going to be as a non-reader, somebody who just watched the movie without reading the book. I think that as somebody who read the book, the movie was really well done for readers of the book, because I could pick up on all the many little nuances that somebody who hasn't read the book would not have seen in the film. The impression I get was that if I had not read the book, I would have found the movie to be just very dry and boring, and I wouldn't have understood half of what was going on. And that's the exact feelings that I've heard from people who have watched the movie without reading the book, although I have also heard from other people who haven't read the book that have absolutely loved the movie. So there are definitely very polarizing opinions about the movie, both from readers and non-readers of the book. It's clear that Villeneuve had a true passion for the source material and was devoted to being as faithful to the books as possible. And so I really appreciate that about the film. I watched one fascinating video on YouTube where they were showing one little scene between Paul and the Reverend Mother with the test of his hand in the box there, and Villeneuve was commentating as they played through that scene, and just every little detail he talked about spoke of his real love of the source material and his true desire to make a film that accurately represented it. And he even said at one point that this was the first movie he's ever made for one person, that person being himself. Now, that doesn't mean he did a perfect job of it. There are certainly some things left out of the movie that I think really should have been included. A lot of people talk about the famous dinner scene that was not included in the movie that was really a pivotal moment in the book, especially towards Paul's development as a leader. Myself, I think the biggest mistake in terms of what was left out was the whole traitor aspect, the idea of a traitor being in the midst of the Atreides, and at one point suspicion being intentionally cast upon Jessica to throw off other people. And in the movie, there's just kind of this traitor that appears and causes the damage and then is done with it, and we don't get the whole tension of who is the traitor, how can characters discover what's going on, and I think leaving that out of the film was a big mistake. I think in general the characters were pretty well represented. I don't think a great job was done with Jessica, though, because in the books she is this really strong character, a follower of the Bene Gesserit, and somebody who has a lot of strength and mental fortitude, whereas in the movie she comes across more as a bit of an emotional wreck, somebody who's just always fearful over Paul and his safety. And I don't feel like we really get to see her true strength as a character in the movie. From a visual perspective, it was very beige and gray. And I get that they're trying to sort of portray this desert world, but the real desert is a real thing of beauty and color and life in reality too. So I feel like they could have brought a little more life to the movie. And the portrayal of Arakeen, the capital city of Dune, it didn't feel like there was a lot of life and activity happening in the city. It just seemed like a lot of kind of stark buildings and whatnot. And there could have been a little more life brought out, I think, in the movie. But from a visual perspective on the whole, I think it was really well represented, so I don't really have any major complaints there. The first time I watched the Dune film, I watched it at somebody's house on TV, and then I decided just to go by myself to the theater just to get the whole big screen experience, and so that was pretty fun. I watched it a second time at the theater and really enjoyed that. So in a nutshell, as a reader of the book, I really appreciated the movie, and I'm definitely really looking forward to catching part 2 and hopefully part 3, and who knows what else beyond that. But enough of the chit-chat. I've gone on long enough. What do you think? Have you read the books? Have you seen the movie? What do you think of the books or the movie? What do you think of my ideas that I've presented here? I would love it if you would carry on the conversation in the comments below. I would love to chat with you more about this. And if you have made it this far in my video, I really appreciate you taking this time with me today. It means a lot that you would watch all of this, so thank you so much. Holy cow, you made it to the end of this video. That really does mean a lot to me. The other thing that means a lot to me is if you would give it a thumb up or subscribe to my channel, or maybe share this video with one person that you think would enjoy it. Cheers. So, the story... So the books on a... Their shoulders held in positions of immovable. Now, moving on from the way the books are, where a character is speaking, which is that if we want to worship something, and then moving ahead of 3, where it says, where a character once again is thinking to herself, and she says, a character. Now speak. The book. Unbelievers Corp approach of the city of Arrakis. I am really appreciative